Shalom. Welcome to the Shepherd's Light Online Church. Before the service starts, we wanted to invite you to join our chat. The chat is where you can ask questions, share verses, and connect with other viewers from around the world. Just write your first comment and choose a nickname to join. If you need prayer, click the live prayer icon and you'll be taken to a private chat where one of our team members will pray with you. The service is about to start. Don't forget to sign up so you can keep your username and profile. God bless you and enjoy the message.
Light of the world, you step down into darkness. Open my eyes, let me see beauty that made this heart adore you. Hope of a life spent with you. So here I am to worship. Here I am to bow down.
Well, God bless you and welcome home. Baruch haba habayita, Ruchim habeim habayita. So good to be back again with you this week, and thanks so much for coming again. And we realize it's not always possible to travel to a service somewhere to fellowship with the other people there, so we bring that service to you, wherever you are, as you already know, anywhere in Israel, for that matter, anywhere in the world. And we hope you'll be encouraged today as you discover God's peace and His promises for your life. Now, would you open in your Bibles to the New Testament? Remember, Be'ivrit in Hebrew, we say New Testament as Habrit HaChadashah. Going to be in the New Testament, Habrit HaChadashah today, at the book of Acts. And oh boy, after this message today, we've only got one more week, and we're finished with the book of Acts. And we'll go on to the book of Daniel HaNavi, Daniel the prophet in the Tanakh. You Jewish people, my brothers and sisters, you know what that book is. In that book of Daniel the prophet, in the book of the Tanakh, it's got a chapter called the Forbidden Chapter. Some of the rabbis don't want you to look at that. Why? Because it tells exactly to the very day when the Messiah would come. And guess who came? If you do all the complex math, if you do that according to that chapter there in chapter 9 of the book of Daniel, you're going to find out it was exactly the same day that Yeshua came into Jerusalem. Exactly. It's just the mathematics. It's involved, but I'll go through it step by step. You don't want to miss our journey through the book of Daniel. But right now we're finishing up the book of Acts in the New Testament. And we remember how we say in Hebrew, the book of Acts is Maaseh HaShlechim. Maaseh HaShlechim. And today we're going to be in chapter 27, Perek Esrim Vesheva, Im Ata Midbar Ivrit. If you speak Hebrew, it's chapter 27, Esrim Vesheva. And we're going to read all of that today. It's 44 verses, and as you can tell, I'm talking a little fast. Already had my coffee. Shouldn't take too long, but you know what happens sometimes is things go wrong, and it does take a little longer than I thought, but we'll see if we can't just speed it up a little bit today. And we're going to put those verses up here for you in the video just to make it easier for you to follow along. And I'd like to talk to you today about being watched by others, being watched by other people. You know, as you go through life, of course, some people find out that you're a believer. You tell them. You certainly don't want to be ashamed of that. You want to be bold, because how else can they have everlasting life unless someone tells them about the everlasting life that they've found in Yeshua? So they know that you're a believer by the words that you say and how you talk to them. But you'd be surprised, they don't pay a lot of attention to that sometimes until they see you going through a trial. Until they see you going through some circumstance that would destroy other people, that would just depress other people, that would make them all so sad. But if they see a true believer going through those trials, and they see that that believer has a hope that they don't have when they go through trials, then they start paying attention. So other people watch you as you go through trials. And then, of course, God Himself is watching over you as you go through those trials, to hold you up, to strengthen you, to let you have hope, to know that you're going to make it out the other side of that trial, out of that darkness and back into the light. But meanwhile, as God is watching over you, other people are looking to see how you handle situations that try your own faith. And that's what our chapter today is showing us in Acts chapter 27. We're going to read it now together, and we'll stop every once in a while, as you know, to go through it and talk about what it all means a little bit at a time. And in Acts chapter 27, beginning at verse 1, it says, "And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coasts of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was also with us. Verse 3 then says, and the next day we landed at Sidon. Okay, and then it says, and Julius treated Paul kindly. He was the centurion in charge of 100 Roman soldiers, but he treated Paul kindly even though Paul was just a lowly prisoner. It says, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. Paul knew people there at Sidon who were believers, and he gave Paul the freedom to go to those people and receive care. He knew Paul was a man of honor, that he would come right back to the ship. He wasn't going to try to escape because the Lord himself had already told him that he was going to Rome, that he had to testify of the Lord in Jerusalem, and that then he was going to testify of the Lord in Rome. So Paul wasn't going to try to escape. This was how he was getting to Rome. He knew that God was really in charge and that his days, his ways, and everything that happened to him was under the control of the Lord. So Paul was content to let the Lord lead him. And so it says that Julius treated Paul kindly in verse 3 and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. And then it says, when we had put out to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Kepharsim. Kepharsim is Cyprus. We say Kepharsim in Bivrit in Hebrew, but it's that big island of Cyprus that's off the shore, some many miles away, off the shore of the western coast of Israel. And it says they sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because it was a big island. It could block the wind and some of the big waves. And they said they sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. See, it was a way that the sailors would sail to avoid those wind and the high waves. And it says in verse 5, then continuing on, and when we had sailed over the sea, which is off of Cilicia and Pamphylia, that's part of Greece, down in Turkey, lower than that, in the Mediterranean, it says we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And then it says in verse 6, then the centurion, remember that was Julius, found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. Well, what's an Alexandrian ship? Well, before Rome was a civilization leader, it ruled the world. All of the civilized world was under the Roman rule. But before that, it was under the rule of the Grecian Empire with Alexander the Great as its leader. One of the greatest world empires the world's ever known. And Alexander was just this highly talented military leader, conquered everything. In fact, as a young man, he was found crying one time because there were no more countries left to conquer. That's how great the conquest of the Grecian Empire was before Rome came along. And so they still had ships from Greece at that time sailing along. And even though Rome was the official leader of the civilized world and the Grecian Empire had fallen to Rome, even though that was the case, the Alexandrian ships, if you will, the ones that came from that era, were still sailing to Italy. And the centurion Julius found an Alexandrian ship that was sailing to Italy. And so they got off of the ship that they had been on, and he put the prisoners and all the other people on board this Alexandrian ship that was already going to Italy. Now, back at that time, it's not like it is in America or like Israel today, where people got to choose what business they take. Roman ruled with an iron fist. The Roman Empire ruled with an iron fist, and everything they said for people to do, the people must do. And so here's the owners of this Alexandrian ship, and this centurion comes over to them and says, I've got these people that have to go to Rome because they're going to appear before Caesar. And the Alexandrian ship owners and the sailors on there said, yes, sir. We're going to be leaving in just a little bit. So Julius put the prisoners and himself on board that Alexandrian ship, it says now, sailing to Italy. Now, why was Paul going to Italy? You may remember the last 2 chapters that we studied over the last few weeks. And by the way, Pastor Yossi Goldberg, my good friend of mine, a good brother, believer in the Lord, did a wonderful job on teaching Acts chapter 26 from Caesarea, from the very place, Caesarea, where those chapters were written. And he did a great job on that last week. And you saw what was going on. Paul was being tried not only by the Jews in Jerusalem, by the religious leaders, the Sadducees, not most of the popular Jewish population there. Many of them were believers there in Jerusalem, but the Jewish leaders, the Sadducees, were so jealous of this new faith in Yeshua, because they wanted to be considered to be the religious experts. But I mentioned before that the Sadducees didn't even believe in the Bible, didn't believe in the Jewish Bible. Oh, they said they believed in just the Torah, but they didn't even acknowledge the Torah, the things that the Torah teaches. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in an afterlife, a heaven or hell. They didn't believe in a judgment that God was going to do. They didn't believe in spirit. They didn't believe in angels. They just must have envisioned man as some sort of animal who didn't have any high and noble calling, even though the Torah said that he was made in the image of God. Male and female, God created them in His image. That's what Genesis says. But these Sadducees didn't believe in any of us. I guess you could say that's why they're sad, you see. I've heard that one before a few times, and I'm sure you probably have too. But anyway, they were judging Paul under their judgment in Jerusalem, and a Roman centurion, not Julius, but another Roman centurion, had to come and rescue Paul because these people were going to kill Paul. He hadn't even had a trial, didn't have anyone defending him, couldn't even talk and give his side of the story. Well, all of that was certainly against the Torah, because the Torah taught that you would have a prisoner give his side of the story, and that he could call witnesses and produce evidence. And these people just took him and started trying to kill him. Rome, a secular pagan nation, if you will, or civilization, had to take these from the so-called religious leaders of that time, these Sadducees, because they weren't doing justice. They were just acting in emotion only and trying to kill Paul. So the Roman centurion down there in Jerusalem rescued Paul, took him up to Caesarea, and there Paul appeared before Felix, a Roman governor, and before Festus, the person who succeeded Felix at that time, and then King Agrippa, a person who knew about the Jewish culture, who was a king over another area that Rome had appointed. So Paul has now had one trial at Jerusalem, not really a trial at all, and then he's spoken to 3 Roman people as their trial and everything like that, and they decided that he's going to Rome. He appeals to Rome. And the Lord had stood alongside of him in a prison one time and told Paul that night that, Paul, it's okay, just like you've testified of me in Jerusalem, so you're going to testify of me in Rome. Now, we saw all these things happening, right? And by the way, the Lord had told him that in Acts chapter 23, verse 11. He said he would testify about the gospel, about Yeshua, in Rome as well. Now remember how important Rome was. That was the capital of the entire civilized world. Not only would the Roman governors or leaders in Rome hear the gospel and become familiar with it, but then Christianity, this new segment of Judaism, would become familiar to them, and it would become a legal religion in the Roman Empire. Believers everywhere would be allowed to worship without being hunted down or killed or imprisoned. So it was important that Paul went to Rome and got to acquaint them with the gospel. Now, he was going as a prisoner. He might be killed there. He might not receive a good audience that would listen to him. But the Lord had prepared the hearts of the people there. And Paul was now on his way to Rome, now on his way to Italy. And so we see Paul in these first verses in chapter 27 being handed over to this Roman centurion, Julius. And remember, the centurion, like we said, was very high up, very trusted Roman officer who was over 100 Roman soldiers. And Julius was now being charged with Paul to keep him and make sure that he got to Rome, along with all of these other prisoners that were going there to Rome in Italy. And he would take them to the capital of the civilized world, Rome. An important task indeed. And Julius would be leading that journey for Rome, but God would be leading this journey for Paul. And along the way, even though Julius was the leader and Paul was just a prisoner, Julius and all the people on the journey would end up listening to Paul and watching Paul because of his close relationship with God. You see what I'm saying? Paul was being watched. You would have thought that Paul wouldn't have any say in things, that he's just a lowly prisoner along with these others and they're going to take him off to judgment. But yet, because of his relationship with God, Paul ended up being the one who was watched closely by the other people. It says in verse 7 as we continue then, and when we had sailed slowly many days, slowly because the wind was adverse to them, we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off the Cineas. The wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. And passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lasea. And then in verse 9, it continues on and says, now when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, he says in verse 10 now, saying, men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion, it says in verse 11, was more persuaded by the helmsman, the captain of the boat, and the owner of the boat, than the things that Paul spoke. Verse 12 then says, and because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority of the people that Julius talked to advised him to set sail from there. If by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, another big island further away and right below the Greek and Italy area, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there instead of in this other place. And so we see now that Paul has been given insight into the dangers that are up ahead. That God has revealed to Paul prophetically the dangers that are on up ahead if they continue sailing. And Paul tries to warn the others, but at this point they ignore Paul. They don't listen to him at all. After all, Paul is just a lowly prisoner. Who is he to say how they might sail and what they should do with the boat or not? And by the way, there's over 270-something people on that boat. A lot of people at stake. These people might be thinking, well, if Paul is so smart, how come he's a prisoner on his way to Rome to be judged? Continuing on now with verse 13. After they wouldn't listen to him, it says, when the south wind blew softly, they supposed that they had obtained their desire in having these calm winds, you see, and they put out to sea and they sailed close to Crete. A big island. Crete's a bigger island than Cyprus. But not long after, it says in verse 14, a tempestuous wind came up, a very strong wind arose, called Euroclydon. And it says in verse 15, so when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. What does that mean in verse 15? The ship was caught and could not head into the wind. It was a big ship, many people aboard it, very big ship, but the wind was so strong that they kept trying to go forward, but they were actually just sitting still or maybe even moving backward because the wind was that strong. So it says we didn't have any choice, we let her drive. The ship you always call her. We let her drive. So basically that just means they just put the sails down and let the ship go where it was going to go. They were out in the middle of the sea, no harm there and everything, and they would wait for the wind to die down and then put the sails back up and try to continue. It says in verse 16 then, and after running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff, the small boat that you could let down off of the ship so that people could go onto and off of the ship. And it was a very large ship, but they had these small skiffs that they would let over the side, just kind of like lifeboats in the big cruise ships today. And they were running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, and they secured the skiff with difficulty. It was hard for them to even get that skiff tied up. Verse 17 then says, when they had taken it on board, the skiff was on board now, they used the cables to undergird the ship, fearing that lest they should run aground on Syrtis sands. And they struck sail and were so driven. They still couldn't fight against the wind, but they tried to use these ropes from the skiff and everything to hold the ship together. That's how powerful the wind was. And they didn't want it to accidentally hit ground as it was being driven by the wind, because remember, they had no control over where they were going. If they hit a shallow area of water and sands beneath there, it could bottom the ship out and tear the ship apart. And then it says in verse 18, and because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, greatly tossed around by the wind, it says the next day they lightened the ship. They didn't want it to be sunk down into the water so much with all of that cargo. It says on the third day we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Look at that, verse 18. The cargo was going overboard, stuff that they would have gotten paid for. That's how they made their living. That was their job. Without that cargo being delivered to where it was going, they wouldn't get paid. But they felt like their lives were in danger, and so they lightened the ship, throwing some of the cargo overboard. And then the next day it says they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Now it says in verse 20, things are going to get worse. Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, that's a roundabout way of saying like, and there were huge winds beating on us. It says all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. Look at that. All hope that they would be saved was finally given up. Now, verse 21. But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of him. Remember, Paul was the guy they just ignored before, and he told them this was going to happen. And now they had fasted because they were working all the time trying to keep the ship on some sort of safe place or safe course in the water. But after a long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not sailed from Crete, and now to incur this disaster and loss. And now he says, he wasn't trying to condemn them. Yeah, he says, you should have listened to me, but now look at all the loss. You've lost your cargo. You've lost your tackle. He said, you've fasted. You've been working without food, but now, he says in verse 22, I urge you, take heart, for there will be no life among you. There will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. He tells them right there, the ship's going to be lost, but no one's going to lose their life. And Paul continues in verse 23. He says, because for there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. That's in Rome. Okay, the capital of the Roman Empire. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, this angel of God says to Paul, and indeed God has granted you all who sail with you. Oh, the grace of God. That he would save not only his person that he was sending there to testify of him, but all of those hundreds of people that were going along with Paul on that big ship. It says, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. What does that mean? Granted you. That means that Paul petitioned God. He prayed for those men. They were the men taking him to a prison. They were the men holding him down below the ship in a prison. He was a prisoner. Those were the guys that were holding Paul as a prisoner, who were taking him to be judged. And what's Paul doing? He's praying for them. He's praying that they will keep their lives and that they will live and that God will rescue them. He says now, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Verse 25, therefore take heart, men, Paul says, for I believe in God, that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. Paul had seen this. Now earlier, we saw in the earlier verses when we first started out, when Paul counseled them not to leave the harbor and everything, we saw that the men didn't listen to Paul. He's not a sailor. He's not a captain of a ship. What experience does he have? But Paul was speaking the words of God. God had prophetically revealed to Paul what was happening, and Paul had told them that he was a man of God. And they had seen now Paul saying this. Well, it's one thing to hear somebody talking about God. It's another thing for a prophecy to be made that God has given that person. They've now thought of everything on that ship. At first trying to save the cargo, they lightened the ship, but they wouldn't be able to get paid if they got rid of it. Nonetheless, their lives were in danger of being lost, so they threw the cargo overboard. Then they thought of everything, throwing the tackle overboard so they couldn't even steer the ship again almost. And it's trying to save their lives. And now they see that Paul has been talking to God, and that God's been talking to Paul. Well, they know that this guy tried to warn them against leaving the harbor, and they did anyway, and now look at all the disaster that came out of that. And now Paul is saying God's been talking to him. And maybe the men on the ship now are starting to think a little bit about what Paul is saying. But they're still not totally convinced, and they don't know what to do, but they start to watch what is happening and seeing if the things that Paul is saying are coming to pass. Continue on in verse 27. Now when the 14th night had come, 2 weeks later, when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down the Adriatic Sea, remember, no sails, no stars, totally dark. They couldn't see where they're going, couldn't navigate by the stars. And they were just all this time in the dark and the sails wouldn't work and the wind was against them and they didn't even know where they were. They were just being drifted along by the wind like a lot of people are in life. No real direction in life, no real hope in life. They're just drifting wherever society tells them. 1 year society says, oh, you should do this. Next year, 2 years later, society says, no, you should do exactly the opposite. 3 years later, it changes again. Now we're living in an age when what was good before 20 years ago is now considered bad. And what was bad 20 years ago is now considered good. And girls are considered to be guys, and guys are considered to be girls. And some people don't even think that's enough. And some people on Facebook, you can put any gender you want, up to 25 different gender identities. Some universities in America, I read just a news story just today and yesterday about a university in the east coast of the United States where it's saying if you call a person by the wrong pronoun, then you can be kicked out of the university. Well, what do you mean the wrong pronoun? Well, if a guy starts saying, well, I'm a girl, I'm going to live life as a girl, but he doesn't like you because you're a Christian, then you come up to him, you don't know that he's made this decision to try to live life as a girl, and you call him he or him, then you could be kicked out of the college. Another guy might say, well, I'm a guy. And then you call him a guy, you call him a him, and then he changes his mind because he doesn't like the fact that you're a Christian, and he says, no, I'm a girl. And you get kicked out of the college when he had never said that before. And then after you're kicked out, he's a guy again. Crazy, crazy world that we live in today. And it says they sensed that they were drawing near some sort of land in verse 27. After the 14th night had come, they were being driven up and down the sea. About midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. How do they get sense that land might be approaching? Well, they would take what they call soundings, if you will. They would lower a rope with a weight on it and see how much rope they had to let out to reach the bottom before the weight disappeared and it was resting on the bottom of the sea. And so then they would do that every so often. And then if they saw that it was getting less and less distance between the bottom of the boat and the bottom of the sea, they said, well, we must be getting near land. Verse 28, so they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. That's how deep it was in one place. And they went a little bit farther. They took soundings again and found it was now 15 fathoms. Verse 29, then lest fearing that they would run aground on rocks, they dropped 4 anchors at the stern. At least they could keep from being blown around by dropping anchors. They couldn't control where they were going, but they could drop these big, heavy cast iron anchors, and hopefully they would catch on something at the bottom and see and hold them in place to where they wouldn't drift into more shallow waters. And it says, then the sailors prayed for day to come. Prayed for day to come so they could see if there's any land over there, because they felt like they were getting close to land. Must be some sort of island. They didn't know where they were. They had been drifting for 14 days. And it says in verse 30, and as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship because they thought there was land over there, when they had let down the skiff into the sea under the pretense of putting out anchors for the prow, it said, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall into the water. Now we've reached this point. At first, when Paul offered advice and a warning about leaving the harbor, no one listened to him. You're just a lowly prisoner. All these people are experienced sailors. We're smarter than you. We're leaders of all these people and everything like that. We'll do what we decide to do. Just go away, Paul. We'll take care of the sailing. And then the ship came into disaster. Cargo was thrown overboard. Tackle was thrown overboard. People were feeling like their life was going to be ending pretty soon. And now some of these guys, when they feel that they're close to land, they tell people, oh, we're going to let down some more anchors to save the ship. But really, they're using that little skiff to try to get away and save their own selves by going to land, because they feel that land is over there close by. But then Paul saw what was happening, and he knew from God that all the men had to remain in the ship for all of them to be saved. And so Paul said, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. He told this to Julius and the soldiers. So Julius, being the centurion, and the 100 soldiers that were under his charge, stopped these guys from lowering the skiff into the water. They cut the ropes and let the skiff fall and just float away. It says in verse 33, as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them. He tried to encourage them to take food, saying, today is the 14th day you've waited, and you've continued without food, and you've eaten nothing. Verse 34, Paul then, concerned for them, not for himself, says, therefore I urge you to take some nourishment, for this is your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. And when they had heard this, it says in verse 35, when they had heard these things, Paul took bread, gave thanks to God in the presence of them all, and when he had broken it, he began to eat, and they were all encouraged, and they took food for themselves. And in all, it says, we were 276 persons on the ship. Now think about these things. What's going on here? At first, they wouldn't listen to Paul at all. Then they start seeing the ship and all of its cargo and the disaster being fulfilled by the words that Paul said. And now Paul is encouraging them, take some food. He's caring for them. And he prayed to God for them that they would be saved. And the angel of God came and said, God has given you all those that sail with you. No one's going to perish. And so basically, Paul is now saying, take some food, because God's shown me not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. None of you are going to perish. Not only that, none of you are even going to be harmed. Not a hair is going to fall from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, now they thought about it this time. And they go, this is a guy that told us that there was going to be this big disaster at sea. And that happened. This is the guy that told us not to let down that skiff so that we could all be saved. This is the guy who's talking to God, and God's talking to him, saying that we're going to be okay. So they listened to Paul, and they were encouraged. It says in verse 36, and they also took food for themselves. Verse 37, then we continue toward the end of the chapter. It says, and in all we were 276 persons on the ship. Think about this. Paul is the person that God is trying to get to Rome so that he can speak to Caesar, so that he can be judged in Rome, to where all of the Roman Empire can hear about this new gospel and about Yeshua HaMashiach, the Jewish Mashiach, the most famous Jewish man who ever lived. HaMashiach, the Lord himself, would give his life for our sins so that we could be with him forever. And here's God's heart. He could have just transported Paul spiritually to Rome, and Paul would have found himself standing in the middle of Rome, there before Caesar. But God took him through this journey. And sometimes you wonder, well, why am I in this trial that I find myself in? Why are all these bad things happening to me and around me? Sometimes it's not about you. Sometimes God brings you through these trials so that others who are watching you, who are listening to you, can learn about God's love for them too. And that's exactly why Paul is on this journey. And through it all, 276 persons on this ship will not die. And 276 persons on this ship will see this man called Paul as he worships God, trusts in God, prays to God, and God answers. This man called Paul, when he speaks of the good news in Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah. 276 persons on this ship are saved. Paul, going through trials, but you never hear him complain. He knows that God's on the throne. He knows that God has a plan, that God knows what he's doing. And now Paul is content, praying for these people. He's the one going through the trial too. He's the one going on trial in Rome, will be judged, and who knows what's going to happen there. You know, he doesn't know at that time. All he knows, he's going to stand before Rome and be judged for that. And the gospel, and the word of the gospel is going to get out to Rome so the rest of the civilized world can hear about it. And Christianity can be legalized, and people won't lose their lives for being believers so much anymore, at least for a while, until another Roman emperor comes along. But we see Paul going through this trial. And yet, because of the trial he's going through, God uses that trial to save 276 other people from dying. So these people were encouraged, it says in verse 38, and when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, and they threw out even the wheat into the sea. At that point, they knew that God was with them somehow. They were going to continue to follow what Paul was saying now. Didn't matter who the owner of the ship was. Didn't matter who the captain or the helmsman was. Didn't matter. Even Julius and the soldiers were going, yeah, Paul, whatever you say, you're the guy, you're the guy. And so it says, when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. And it says in verse 39, when it was day, they did not recognize the land. Oh, they saw the land, but they didn't recognize. They didn't know where they were. But they observed a bay with a beach on it, onto which they planned to run the ship impossible, and hopefully that ship would just gradually go up on the sand and land, and they'd be able to get off the ship safely, and even the ship itself might be reusable after that. But they planned to run the ship on the beach if they could. But verse 40 says, and they let go of the anchors, and they left them in the sea. They couldn't put those anchors down again. They left the anchors where they were. They might have been stuck on something on the bottom of the sea. The wind was blowing them. They couldn't lose a minute. The wind was blowing the right direction so that it would blow the ship into the beach. But meanwhile, they loosed the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for the shore. The wind was blowing them into the shore, so they used every opportunity they could. And verse 41 says, but striking a place where the two seas met as it came around that island, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern back behind was being broken up by the violence of the waves. It was stuck. These waves up at front were beating on the ship this way. The waves at the back were beating on the ship this way, twisting it and breaking up the ship in two. And verse 42, it says, and the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. That was just the mentality of the soldiers. They were trained that if you lost a prisoner, it would be your own life. So if there was a situation where a prisoner might escape, soldiers could decide to kill the prisoners instead, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, remember Julius, the centurion, who was over those 100 soldiers, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. And verse 44, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship that were breaking up. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. It's interesting to me, here these soldiers were going to do what they were usually taught to do, kill the prisoners, but don't let those prisoners escape. Otherwise, they would be killed. But the centurion wanted to save Paul, and he kept them from doing that because he was their officer over those 100 soldiers. Why would the centurion want to save Paul? He was an officer over 100 other men. Officer over 100 other soldiers. They don't just pick those guys because they're good fighters. They pick them because they're smart. This centurion had seen Paul prophesy about the danger to the ship. And then the things that prophesied came to pass when the ship was being destroyed and the winds and the seas were unruly and they couldn't find a place to anchor. The centurion saw that. The centurion saw what Paul was saying when he said that God would save them all and provide a way for them, and that with Paul, all of these 276 men would be safe and not lose their life. The centurion saw that. Here they are right by land now. He knows that those guys are not going to lose their life. He's seen Paul. He's seen Paul talk about what God said to him. Paul is talking about what God said to Paul the night before and earlier that day. And the centurion recognizes this man Paul, even though he's a prisoner, really is a man of God. And God really is talking to him. So the centurion wants to save Paul. He blesses Paul and keeps these guys from killing the prisoners, including Paul. And then he commanded those soldiers and all the rest of the people to jump overboard first and get to land if you could swim. And the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship as it was breaking up. So it was that they all escaped safely to land. Now, let's talk about the title of this message, Watched by Others. You see where we're going now. Here's what I'm saying in this message today. In the same way that Paul was being watched by others on that ship as it was being tossed around in the seas, others are watching you as you go through trials in life. They may know that you're a believer, but they want to see if a believer really believes that God is with them. And they want to see if God really takes care of His believers. So you settle it in your heart to trust in God. Not only in the good times, the times when you're blessed greatly and everything's going well, but also in the times of trials, when you don't know how you're ever going to get out of it alive. When you don't know how that you're going to get out of that darkness and back into the light. When you keep your head up and your life in the Lord's hands, when you trust in Him to deliver you, others are going to be watching you to see if your faith is real. And also remember one other thing, that while others are watching you, God Himself is watching over you. Here's what I'm saying. You're His child. He's God Almighty, and He loves you. You're going to see that He's walking you through life to keep you safe in those trials. That He's going to bring you out the other side and into His glorious light. So you just rest in Him. Honor Him with what you do and say. Speak of Him to others. And you watch what God will do with your life. Amen. Now, why don't you give your life to the Lord today, completely, right now? If you call out to Him, He'll hear that cry. He'll answer you. He'll rescue you from that darkness you're in. He'll shine His light on your heart and you'll be given a new life. In fact, He'll change you into a new person. Throw all those past failures away. You'll be made completely new, given a new hope in life, given a new start, and He'll give you everlasting life in heaven, and that's guaranteed by God Himself, the greatest gift for the simplest act, simply believing in the Son of God. We want to give you an opportunity to believe in Jesus as the Messiah and Lord today, and to receive this peace of God in your own life, this peace that we're talking about today. You can be saved, given everlasting life in heaven by simply believing that God sent His one and only Son into the world to save us from judgment. Just pray something like this, and you can repeat it after me if you'd like. Just say, God, I do want to know You. I do want to have this real peace in my life. I need this peace in life, God. I believe on Your Son, Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah, as Lord. Please forgive all my sins. I give my life to You, and I thank You, Lord. Amen. Now, if you prayed that prayer, I'll tell you, God heard you. And even now, He's already started working in your life. You may not realize it, but a little seed's been planted deep down in your heart. Over time, you're going to begin to see the wonderful changes that God's making in your life. You get in a good Bible-based church. You learn about Him every day in His Word. You talk to Him every day in prayer. I'll tell you, He's going to do beautiful things in your life.
Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, Your perfect love is casting out fear. And even when I'm caught in the middle of the storms of this life, I won't turn back, I know You are near, and I will fear no evil, for my God is with me. And if my God is with me, whom then shall I fear? Whom then shall I fear? Oh no, You never let go through the calm and through the storm. Oh no, You never let go in every high and every low. Oh no, You never let go, Lord. You never let go of me. And I can see a light that is coming for the heart that holds on, a glorious light beyond all compare. And there will be an end to these troubles, but until that day comes, we'll live to know You're here on the